Good evening. My name is Sandra Fritz. I'm the chairperson of the Shrewsbury School Committee, and welcome to our meeting of February 10th. Tonight's meeting is broadcast live on Selco channels 29 and 329, and it is streamed live on Shrewsbury Media Connections website. I'd like to thank SMC Executive Director Mark Serra, as well as Shrewsbury Public Schools IT Director Brian LaRue, who help with all of our meetings. First on the agenda is public participation. No one has asked to address the committee this evening, but if anybody wishes to do so in the future, please contact us at schoolcommittee@shrewsbury.k12.ma.us. Next is chairperson and members report. Does anyone have anything this evening? Ms. Heffernan.
Yes, if I can really briefly, I want to just, obviously the weather sometimes gets us down with all of the snow days and the like and dealing with this, but I do want to call out Oak physical education teacher Jeffrey LaRose has, in my mind, moved mountains to figure out how to get 7th and 8th graders sledding during physical education. It has brought so much joy. Just as I'm leaving the house, we had to refine the snow pants and the gloves for tomorrow, but finding a way for the kids to have fun, to do something new. He somehow got his hands on dozens and dozens of sleds, which I'm sure they are brutalizing, but just another example of a teacher really going above and beyond to try to find a good way to do something special, even if they're only in school a couple of days, and get out there. I understand that Principal Jones has been used as the disciplinary measure because they're by her window, so they're making sure they stay physically distanced while doing this, and they said if she sees us and we're not, then we're going to lose this. So, but really just want to thank all the teachers who are going above and beyond. It was really just a great example and has brought a lot of happiness to our house. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Great, thank you. Next is superintendent's report.
Thank you. I will piggyback on that. In addition to Oak, I know the high school has been doing a lot of outdoor activities in the snow in terms of their physical education program, including some snowshoeing and some use of the ice rink that's installed in the outdoor basketball courts. Those of you who have been here for a bit may recall we had a very substantial federal physical education grant about 6 years or so ago. And we were able to install climbing walls in all the schools, and but that additional ice rink was part of that as well, and we're using that regularly as part of physical education as well. So there our phys ed teachers and department, under the leadership of Jeff Lane, have been really innovative, as our teachers have been, to try to find ways to engage kids in ways that they can under the circumstances with COVID. So thanks for mentioning that, Ms. Heffernan. In terms of the snow, we did make some history this week. In Shrewsbury, we had the first ever remote learning day in lieu of a snow day. The storm did not materialize as much. Early in the morning, they were still predicting 7 inches for here, and the timing was not good. We have had 2 traditional snow days to date, and we were pleased to do that, of course, at the same time with a lot of winter left. And having being out to mid-June already, we decided we would give a remote learning day a go. We know that that can be a challenge for families to some degree. We let people know the evening before and allow them to do some planning. As far as the remote learning aspect of it, it seemed to go smoothly. We'll continue to consider what makes sense going forward as we get more weather, and we'll try to give people as much forewarning as possible. But I appreciate the flexibility on families' part, students' part, and of course our staff adjusting to doing some things differently. And that's with the option of utilizing technology to make that happen. So another historic first in this year of historic elements. And that is Superintendent's report this evening.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to stay with Dr. Sawyer, and he will provide an update on the school district's response to the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fritz. Again, we'll start with the key messages, of course, focusing on the health and well-being of our students and staff as our top priority, and families as well, of course. Our focus is on developing a safe school environment for our students. We're prioritizing well-being and at the same time high levels of learning. And we continue to look for guidance from the state, whether that's state public health, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education for educational issues. And we continue to consult with our medical experts and public health experts to see how the pandemic is moving forward. We've had some good news recently relative to case counts in the state and the community. The schools have been generally good news as well overall. This week, we're hopeful to see that the trend continue. We've only had 6 cases to date this week, or since Sunday. That's included 0 cases the last 2 days in the hybrid model. And hopefully that's the start of a trend. We see that our cumulative cases in hybrid since the start of the year are now 324. Since the last time I reported, our numbers of cases traced to possible exposure in school has titched up from the same situation where we had some suspected in-school spread at Coolidge School. We did have the Mass Department of Public Health's mobile testing come out. They did identify another couple of cases which we, again, can't confirm, but are possible in-school spread. So we did keep a classroom remote for a longer period of time as a result of that, but it appears to be isolated to that classroom and to one other situation that is tangentially related. In the remote program, we did have 1 case this week to date, and we've had 24 total among our students and staff who do not set foot in the school buildings because they are all remote. The next slide indicates that you can see the case counts over the last few weeks. We had a drop from 25 to 15, tished up to 20, and then again to 26. I think, again, there's been somewhat, these have been more clusters, mainly related to some outside of school situations with families, multiple members of a family becoming positive. And we're hoping that number is going to move in a downward direction for next week. This next slide is the one we've shown traditionally that shows all the states. This is a good trend across the nation where these numbers are coming down in terms of positivity rates. When I reported to you 2 weeks ago that the Massachusetts rate was 4.62, now it's down to 2.86. That's a very promising development, especially since, while we know the vaccine's being rolled out, I don't believe it's, would be having such an effect, more widespread effect on overall testing in the population. So hopefully that trend continues as well. The next slide shows, again, a trend that we like for our Shrewsbury cases. This is based as of the last public health report published on February 4th, which even trails a little bit before that. I have those dates on a subsequent slide. But we'd like to see that downward trajectory with the positivity rates, where we're now at 3.84% and back below that 5% benchmark that the World Health Organization recommends for sort of broad opening in society. This next slide is a new one. I want to thank Blake Stewart, who's an office assistant in central office, who's been doing some various graphs and charts for us recently. This just shows the total case. Some people have asked me what the ratio is between students and staff. And of all the cases we've had at this point, this includes hybrid and remote cases, all of our cases, we're at 82% of those cases having been students and 18% of them having been staff. Again, the vast majority are from, connected to outside of school exposure. I'll give those statistics in a little bit. I was on a call with a number of superintendents earlier today, and someone had asked about this ratio, and it's remarkably similar. There were probably about 8 different districts represented on that phone call, and everyone was right around 20% staff. So it's very similar to what we're seeing happening in other school districts as well. This next slide just gives a visual representation that's on our dashboard, which is how many cases we've had per school. Clearly we've had, generally fewer among our younger students. 2 middle schools are remarkably close in terms of the total number of cases each. And the high school has had the most cases, and we've seen that right along. Again, this is a mix of student and staff cases, and at a future report, I'm curious to look at sort of on a percentage basis of the student population. Obviously, the high school has about, total in the high school hybrid community, about 1,700 students, where we have, in hybrid across the 2 middle schools, a similar number of kids. But again, something we've been paying attention to is by the age level and by school, and that's just a visual representation of that. This next slide is also new. This just gives you a history going all the way back to September when we began school again, what our case counts were on a week-by-week basis. You can see certainly that trend where we had low case numbers in the fall. Then following Thanksgiving, like around the rest of the state, we had the significant increase that stayed relatively high over the course of the December holiday season. Then it's been trending downward overall, and hopefully the little uptick last week will be, the last week is just half a week, the week of February 7th, that's the week we're currently in. So again, we're looking at this data for trends over time, and we'll continue to monitor it closely. This is the data that is from the public health report from the state. This is the case count. Their last 2-week period they reported on was January 17th through January 30th. There were 191 cases, which was down from well over 400 cases the previous report, of 2 reports ago. It's 13.6 cases a day, 34.5 per 100,000, and the 14-day positivity rate was 3.84%, and we expect that's going to keep coming down as we go through these next few weeks. We're back in the yellow zone, which is a better place to be. We'd been in the red zone for a number of weeks prior to that, and we're in the yellow because of that less than 5% positivity rate as far as the 14 days. So that's a good news. This is just a slide reminding people that we are following best practices when it comes to mitigation strategies, that we're using masks, we're social distancing, hand hygiene, cleaning and disinfecting. We're doing very aggressive contact tracing. We do have cases. Our nurses have done an unbelievable job with that. And that's why we're having very low risk of transmission in our schools, and the data bear that out. This next slide talks about the guidance that we have from the state, just to remind people that they're mainly focused on transmission in schools, otherwise really encouraging people to have in-person learning to the extent possible. Next slide, of course, if feasible, they would like communities that are in yellow or green to be in person as fully as possible. In red, to remain in hybrid, which we did. Obviously, we'd like to see this trend continue. And I know we've had a couple of inquiries, and we are certainly working and looking at what the different possibilities may be as the case counts continue to go in the right direction, as vaccines are rolled out for ultimately, eventually, for educators in the hopefully pretty near future. That is something that obviously we would love to be back more fully in person. And that is planning that we are, doing a variety of things behind the scenes, and we are going to continue to ramp that up, especially now that we are looking ahead to the vaccine taking effect. So more to come in the future on those issues. Again, I want to emphasize that it's been important for us to maintain stability. Because of our 6-foot distancing, we've been able to avoid lots of, ins and outs of shutdowns because of quarantining and so forth. And that's something that has been a positive for us to stay, with a sort of a stable schedule for students. And as we look at these case counts and positivity rates, the increases we had are concerning. I didn't update the data from the language. The fact that they're decreasing now allows us to start thinking about what other options we might be able to have. This next slide I mentioned about suspected in-school transmission, and again, we had Department of Public Health come out to do some additional testing at Coolidge. But again, the overall numbers at this point, out of all the cases we've had in our hybrid model, 2.2% of them are suspected to possibly be in-school transmission, whereas 97.8% of the cases are not due to the in-school transmission based on our contact tracing. I do want to also update the committee on the pooled surveillance testing that we began with our staff. We had our first week last week. It was an excellent news story. I certainly want to thank Karen Isaacson, our Director of Extended Learning, who has been heading up the logistics of that, along with Mr. Collins and Noel Freeman, our Director of School Nursing. Our COVID assistants in the different schools have been handling the testing, which has been very simple and very easy. It's a shallow nasal swab. You have a QR code that you've downloaded that's connected to you as an individual. You swab yourself, put it in the test tube in the bag. You bring it to the collection site. They scan your phone. They scan the tube to make sure the two are connected. You drop it off. It is very simple. And we had 469 staff who voluntarily were tested. We only had 2 positive tests. They were both asymptomatic individuals, which is a 99.99% negative rate among staff, which we really hope it gives some reassurance and peace of mind to our staff. We just did our second week of testing today. We do it on Wednesday afternoons when the students are remote, and we hope to have those results by Friday. Typically, it's about a 48-hour turnaround, and and because of the snow days that were kind of worked in, we think we had some people who wanted to test who didn't. So we think those number of staff will continue to go up, and we want to get as many as we can to participate, because that gives us the best sense of what the prevalence could be within the school. But obviously, this is a great news story. 99.9% were negative as far as the staff who were tested. So again, I want to finish the report by looking ahead with some optimism that things will be getting better. But we have to analyze our current circumstances and look at, that balanced view of risk we try to take throughout, reviewing data, consulting with our medical and health experts, and we'll continue to look at what our different options are in terms of the kind of learning opportunities we provide to our students. So that's the update on our COVID pandemic situation. I'd be happy to take any questions or comments the committee has.
Thank you. Any questions or comments in the report? Jason?
First of all, thank you for the presentation. I'm wondering if you could comment briefly on vaccination and staff. Every so often you see some dialogue about, why aren't teachers getting vaccinated? Obviously, to my knowledge, we've certainly not been provided with any supply of vaccination, but just wondering if you could comment a little bit on how that is being structured to the best of your knowledge.
Sure. Noel Freeman has been working with our public health contacts, as well as, try to set up, we've been able to, because phase one included school nurses, so our school nurses were able to get their first shot. We're now in we do have a small number of employees who are 75 years age of older, and they're working in their vaccines on their own. And then, then moving it down, we'll have a few that are over 65 as well. As far as the movement to being prepared when we get to that phase in phase two where K through 12 educators and preschool educators are eligible, Ms. Freeman has been working with a local pharmacy chain with whom we've worked in the past to do flu shots, to see if we would be able to do something similar where we could have clinics here at the schools. And they're very willing to work with us on that. The big question mark is they just don't know when they're going to get a supply. And so, that Ms. Freeman, in preparation for that, surveyed our staff, and a very, very high response rate from our staff who responded to it. And of those who responded, I think it was about 94% indicated that they would be willing and able and wanting to take part in a school-based clinic to get their shots. So we think we could do that very efficiently. We have a history of doing that for flu shots every year. And so really it comes down to getting the supply that we can access quickly. We're part of the Central Mass Health Alliance, of course, which works with Worcester Public Health as the lead agency, and having access to their site. And of course, now that they're opening up more, I heard the news on the way over here that they're opening up some more large vaccination sites, but obviously one at Worcester State that's opening up. But we believe we would like to try to provide the opportunity to make it convenient for our staff to do something through our schools. But it really is going to depend on supply. If they can get a hold of enough to do that, then that's what our preference will be. And so hopefully, once that next phase, part of the phase opens up, we can move ahead very quickly.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I think the information about the pool testing is that reassurance, and I know this summer when we were talking with our union representatives and, mitigating risk with masks and social distancing and things like that, but the data now that we're getting with the pool testing, I think is going to add to that reassurance that it is safe to be in the classroom and with students. I think that's very helpful. So thank you to Mr. Collins and Noel for really pushing this. I think it's just that other piece that we need to add. Dale.
Just one quick comment. In looking at your statistics and looking at this email I get every day from the town regarding their COVID cases, it looks to me like the rate of COVID in the schools is the same or less than the rate of COVID in the community. And so that argues for the notion that the schools are not a place where your risk is increased.
Yeah, and that dovetails with the fact that, we can trace the vast majority of our cases to very clear outside of school exposures. We have some, a small number of kind of unknown, not sure where someone got it, but there's no, in those cases, we're not seeing someone else who's connected to them in the school, who might sit nearby or be in the same class or sit with them at lunch. We're not seeing transmission there. Again, we've only had about 2% of our cases where we suspect there could have been a direct transmission between two individuals at the school. So I think that matches that exactly, and I think that's an excellent point, Dr. McGee.
Great, thank you. Okay, moving on. Next on the agenda, we are going to talk about the fiscal year 2022 budget. Dr. Sawyer and Mr. Collins will present the recommendation.
Thank you. And let me begin, before we move into the slides, with a thank you to Mr. Collins for the incredible amount of work he's done on this process over the past months. I'd like to thank Kim Fitzpatrick, who is his key right hand in the business office, who is responsible for a great deal of the construction of this budget book, which the school committee I know has received an electronic copy of, and which is substantial and provides a lot of data and information. We'll have that posted on our website tomorrow for the public to review. I want to thank, it has been a different year. Typically, we'd be doing a lot more upfront work with our leadership team, but because of the situation, which I will get to explaining, certainly in this process, Mr. Collins and I will speak to, it's just a very different year when it comes to what we're looking at and why it is that we are taking the approach that we are. But I think to begin, it's important to set the context for what we're experiencing. So the first slide I want to share is that our school district is facing an education emergency. Now, I've been in this role as superintendent for a dozen or so years. I've been in the school district for 20-plus years. It would be my hope that those who have heard me present over the years, both as a school-based administrator and as a central office district administrator, that I try not to be hyperbolic in my approach in terms of what I present. So when I use a term like emergency, I hope that people do not perceive that this is hyperbole. It is because that is what I determine, based on my best professional judgment, is the situation we find ourselves in. We've seen lots of headlines. This first one, pandemic learning loss grows as schools race to reopen. We know that we're seeing more and more studies come out on a national basis that indicate that students, are falling behind in a variety of ways academically, which stands to reason just given the nature of what's happening. It is a suboptimum kind of educational situation. Obviously, it's not one that would be of our choosing. This next slide's headline references is from the Globe article recently that this is something that is really affecting students who might struggle to read in particular. We know that when students at the elementary age are having difficulties reading, there's some well-grounded research that students who don't learn to read effectively by third grade often have a variety of issues academically for the remainder of their school careers that affect them really in a lifelong way. And we are definitely worried about kids that we are not having as much contact with in the kind of instructional capacity that we typically would. So this is something that obviously is also on our mind. The next slide, we've all heard different reports about students' mental health, that these emergencies have skyrocketed after COVID-19. This is very sobering, of course, because this goes directly to the health and well-being of our students. In terms of statistics, what I can share with you is that we just finished the first semester at Shrewsbury High School, and compared to the first semester last year, which of course was entirely pre-COVID, we have double the number of mental health hospitalizations for Shrewsbury High School students. We've had 47 hospitalizations to date. And that is very similar to what I'm hearing from other superintendents and other school districts in terms of typically a doubling of emergency kinds of situations, higher degrees of suicidal ideation. These are things that you can read on a national level, regional level. It is definitely something that is deeply, deeply concerning about the situation that we find ourselves in. In addition to that, the next slide is a headline talking about educators' mental health. This has been an extraordinarily stressful experience for our educators. Like in other frontline occupations, the grind of working through this pandemic, having to do so many things differently, having so many changes that come at us and seemingly out of nowhere that require people to shift gears. It has been, I remain, and as I expressed to the staff whom I spoke to, all the staff today, this afternoon, via Zoom, I don't pretend to know what it's like to be in their shoes, but I know that I am enormously grateful for the work that they've been doing, the perseverance they've demonstrated. But there's no two ways around it. This has been incredibly difficult work that has challenged people and has led people to levels of stress or that have not been healthy. So that's not unique to Shrewsbury by any means. And then, in addition, the next headline, talks about the struggles that parents have experienced. Our families have been challenged to, whether, trying to balance work, helping their children, especially if they have younger children, at home with their remote learning on the days that they're home. This is something that has been extremely difficult for our families and taxing. So for all those reasons, this has been a very, very difficult situation. And it's something that, we need to work through and continue to work through in a way that we care for each other and support each other. And everyone is really doing the best they can to make this work. The next slide, and I'll reiterate some of the themes I mentioned at our last meeting in my State of the District report, but it is my judgment that this pandemic has created what is the greatest crisis regarding the academic, social, and emotional needs of our children that we have certainly faced in decades, and our children are counting on us to help them through it. Additionally, we have another situation around the crisis that really is not due to the pandemic. It is exacerbated by the pandemic in different ways, but it is not fundamentally due to the pandemic, and that is the structural funding dilemma that our community faces. We've struggled with this structural funding issue for years, and it does threaten to severely compromise our ability to meet our students' needs, and this is at a critical time when they need our strong support. The reality of potentially having to reduce our schools' resources next year because of this structural funding problem will compound the educational damage of the pandemic. And that is something I don't believe as a community we can afford to let happen. Next year, more than ever, our schools need our community to provide the resources that are necessary to meet our students' needs. And that is something that is incumbent upon me as a superintendent, our leadership team, and I suggest the school committee to advocate for our students and our educators to get what they need in order to do the best we can to support students during this incredibly difficult time. So this budget really comes as a simple recommendation. Number one, to maintain the current staffing levels and programs that we have in place right now. And two, to open the new Beal School as planned. So that's the most simple way I can boil this down. Keep our current staffing levels, do not cut anything additional, because as a reminder, go to the next slide, this budget recommendation doesn't restore any of the $1.9 million of cuts that we experienced this year. We lost 30 staff approximately. We've added some staff for COVID purposes using COVID money that's come to us from the state and federal government. But in terms of our actual educational operation, we are down 30 positions this year compared to the previous year. And this budget recommendation before you this evening does not restore any of that because I don't believe it's feasible to even think about doing that right now, just given the financial situation. The second piece is to open the new Beal School as planned. I just want to remind people that this requires adding the new staff that are necessary to implement the redistricting plan across the elementary zones, to provide equitable class sizes, access to educational spaces across all 5 of the elementary schools, which would now be all K-4, and to provide access to full-day kindergarten for all students. All the things that we planned as a result of opening this new school. How can we put those into place? That's something that is embedded into this budget, the resources to do that. So the budget recommendation this evening is for a total of $75,440,214. That's an increase of about $7.45 million, or 10.95%. And for those who are familiar with the budget process, that's a much larger ask than is in a typical year, and we will explain why during this presentation, why that is. Obviously, a large portion of that is due to the opening of the new Beal, but there are other aspects that have to do with how we made our way through this year without further damage that contributed to that being a larger needed increase than in a typical year. Last night, Mr. Kevin Mizikar, the town manager, presented his budget initially to the Board of Selectmen and to the community. And you can see on this slide, we now are able on this first presentation of the school department budget identified the gap that we have between what the town manager is recommending. And we'll mention this later, but just to be clear, the town manager's recommendation is based on his responsibility and to present a budget that is in balance based on the amount of revenue, the amount of resources the town will have. It is not a commentary on what he thinks the school department should or should not get, or any other town department. And I'm quite confident from all of our conversations with Mr. Mizikar that he is very supportive and wants to provide the school department with as many resources as the town possibly can, but that is very limited in terms of what can be provided. So you can see on the status quo budget, which is about 8.5% of our recommendation, we would have about a $3.2 million gap between what's recommended by the town manager. And if you add on top of that the additional $1.7 million that it will take to open Beal according to our plan, that creates a gap of about $4.9 million. Now, we've had some sizable budget gaps in past years, but this is an especially daunting one, especially coming on the heels of a $2 million reduction in services this current year. So, with that, I just want to give a little bit of context, as every year we have some parents, community members who are new to Shrewsbury, may not have been part of budget conversations or presentations in the past, because the natural question is like, well, if you need this much money or you're looking for a large increase, well, what are you spending now and can you be more efficient? And I think it's really critical for people to understand, and those who have been paying attention for a long time know this. We are extraordinarily cost efficient, and we spend well below what typical school districts in Massachusetts spend on a per pupil basis, which is the apples to apples comparison that the Department of Education provides each year. You can see on this slide, the blue line is the state average per pupil expenditure, and then the red line is Shrewsbury. You can see about halfway through in fiscal year 2015, that's the override that was passed in 2014. You see a little bump there. It's been pretty flat since then. And you can see, and the state data only goes through fiscal year 2019, fiscal year 2020. Last year's data will be published probably sometime in March or April. But this is the most recent data we have. We're in the bottom 11% of all districts in Massachusetts in terms of what we spend on a per pupil basis. That's 286 out of 320. And I think it's just important to note, to try to get a sense of the magnitude of that. If you take that differential of the $14,248 that we spend per pupil as of fiscal 19, and you compare that to the $17,149 that an average Massachusetts district would spend, there's a difference there. And that difference may not seem like it's that much when you're just talking about one student. But you multiply that by the 6,000 plus students that we're responsible for, and you get a figure of $18.63 million. We would be spending an additional $18 million every year if we spent at the state average. Not spent more than the state average, as many of our peer districts do, but just at the state average, which gives you a sense of the magnitude of how far below the typical Massachusetts district we are spending in terms of resources and investments in our students. This next slide gives one example of a peer group. There's more in your school committee in the budget packet. This is a group that's selected by ClearGov, which is a government transparency software that we subscribe to. There's all kinds of data on the town website and the school department website that people can dig into. But they, based on a variety of socioeconomics, ClearGov selected, not us, but ClearGov selected North Attleboro, Arlington, Belmont, Franklin, Chelmsford, and Natick as peers that are fair comparisons in terms of spending. And you can see on a per pupil basis, other than North Attleboro, we're spending substantially below most of those districts. And that's where some economy of scale comes into play. And again, when you start multiplying that out by the number of students, you're talking about millions of dollars difference. So compared to our peers, we invest less than in our educational services. And this next slide is something that I think is important in terms of context. As a community, someone might say, well, what's our ability, what's our capacity to provide resources for town government, for all the things that we want our town government to do. And of course, a critical part of town government is providing education for the vast majority of children in Shrewsbury. So when you look at our per pupil expenditure, which we just spoke about, that's in the bottom 11% in the state. When you look at the two factors that the state actually looks at in their Chapter 70 state funding formula for education, they look at a town's property value and they look at the personal income in that town on a per capita basis. And when you look at personal income, Shrewsbury is in the top 20% in the state, 70th out of 351 communities. And when we look at property value, it's the top 14% in the state, 49th out of 351 communities. So there's a disparity there between those statistics and what we're investing in our students in our schools that I think is important to note. And then finally, before I turn it over to Mr. Collins for some additional information, I think it's important to note this graphic, which shows the requests and initial recommendations that have been made over the years, going back to fiscal year 2009, with regard to what the school department needed to advance its program, to maintain its staffing, to try to make its strategic priorities, to implement them, to make things work as well as we can for the quality of education in Shrewsbury. And you can see that, the blue line is always higher than the red line. And in some years, it worked out, we were able to preserve what we had, maybe make some additional investments. But in many years, that difference between the blue line and the red line meant that we were making reductions. And that has been true, obviously, very starkly this current year. Even some years after the override, we've had to make some reductions. And what we're looking ahead at next year are some really substantial reductions unless we're able to receive some additional funding to help us maintain what we have and open the new Beal School. But with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Collins, who will bring you through a variety of technical elements of the budget. And then at the end, I'll return to summarize, and then I'll be happy to answer questions from the committee after that. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Collins at this time.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. First, before some of the technical and financial aspects, I do want to, again, provide a little bit more context around, as Dr. Sawyer referenced, the educational emergency that we find ourselves in. And reference to that people come into the budget process at different times depending on their school children or their time availability. So for some of the folks that have been paying attention, what I'm about to tell you about the predictability of where we are right now should not be news to them. If people have been kind of half paying attention to what's going on, this information should provide them a reminder about all the work that's been leading up to where we are, this educational emergency. And if you haven't been paying attention, you might be wondering why, why didn't the folks plan ahead? And so these next slides are going to kind of answer to all three of those groups. So there have been numerous work products by various groups that have been completed over the past 15 to 16 years that speak to our structural funding dilemma and how predictable it is. This is not a surprise to us or anybody around the table, as you know. And some of those reports that I want to reference is going back to December 2005, the school department prepared a 5-year forecast of what the upcoming budgets would look like. In 2007, there was a town fiscal study report that was done. Again, that same type of work was renewed before the override vote by the town fiscal study committee in November of 2013. Included in that group, that report is still on the town's website. That was a composite group of elected officials, town and school administrators, town meeting members, and I'm going to make reference to that on the next slide. The school department did, Dr. McGee and Mr. Samia, who currently serves on the Board of Selectmen, did a really nice piece of work on a 5-year forecast back in February 2017. I'm going to show some of those slides again because they're were very good forecasts. The school department engaged the UMass Collins Center back in April of 2019 to look at the central office organization, the administration. You might remember from that report that there were a number of recommendations that spoke to not cutting staff, but actually adding staff in comparison to our peer school districts that we were understaffed administratively. And then most recently, completed another 5-year forecast in December, which was conveyed to the Board of Selectmen by Mrs. Fritz right before Christmas time, and we presented that to you and to the community back in early January. And all of these things, again, speak to how predictable this structural funding dilemma is. It's no surprise whatsoever. From that Fiscal Study Committee report, I think this is important for folks that can't read this maybe on their screen, but this is from the executive summary, and it says, in quotes, simply put, the Fiscal Study Committee found that there are no viable or realistic alternatives to reduce the expenditures of town government. The committee found that the departments have achieved every level of efficiency that is feasible, from streamlining operations, contracting out services, and regionalization. Costs that can be controlled have been reduced or the rate of growth moderated. Any further reductions would cause severe degradation of services. That's what that composite group of folks found back in 2013. Of course, that led to, I think, helped inform voters for the 2014 override. Just another couple of pieces of work. This is an excerpt from the 2017 5-year forecast report. This is just a copying of the bullet points from that report, literally. Shrewsbury will continue to face significant structural deficits over the next 5 years. We should not expect state and federal revenues to help close this structural deficit. Without additional resources, the school department cannot provide the high-quality public education that the Shrewsbury community expects. Totally predictable where we are right now. This is back from January 2017. As part of the budget process and talking with the school committee and the finance committee meetings, that Dr. Sawyer posed this question, this essential question, back in January 2017. What will our community do to solve the structural funding dilemma that jeopardizes the future quality of public education in Shrewsbury? This is a slide that I copied and pasted into this report, the presentation tonight, from the 2017 5-year forecast, again done by Mr. Sammy and Dr. McGee. You'll see that the blue line that's projected there was a 5-year outlook projecting what the school operating budget would be and what would be needed. And the red bar, the red line, is what was projected at the time by the town manager based upon what he thought would be available revenue resources. And you can see the gap. It's predicted back in February 2017. In fact, it's important to note that back in 2017, this report produced a projection that said the fiscal 22 budget resources that would be needed 5 years forward was $74.1 million. The budget recommendation you have in front of you from Dr. Sawyer is a recommendation for $75.4 million, including opening Beal. Just the status quo budget is $73.7 million. This is a very close forecast approximation to look out 5 years. It's totally predictable. The next slide, same thing with the blue and yellow lines. And what it shows, the big red bar below is showing the accumulated annual deficits that would be faced by the school department. And on an annual basis, it projected a deficit of $5.8 million in fiscal 22. Next slide. This is the December 2020 5-year forecast. Again, it's the most recent 5-year forecast. This was done in December and January. Back then, what was projected for the school department in terms of the upcoming year budget was an 8.5% for status quo and $2 million for opening Beal. You know that the final recommendation that you have from Dr. Sawyer right now is for an 8.5% status quo budget and $1.7 million for opening Beal, so just slightly less. But the point here is not necessarily about fiscal '22, but more importantly about fiscal '23, fiscal '24, fiscal '25, and fiscal '26. We know with great deal of certainty and predictability that the budget resources that we're going to need in fiscal '26 are approximately $92.5 million in each succeeding year prior to that. We have all the data as part of that report that shows the past 20 years of annual increases. You know, the history supports what the future requirements demand. And then finally, this is the last slide to really just kind of drive this point home, is that, you know, for fiscal '22, at the time, based upon the town manager's revenue projection, the deficit was produced that would say that we would have approximately $6 million deficit for fiscal '22, and that each succeeding year, that those deficits would get bigger and bigger without a solution. So that's just a little bit of a history around the work that's been done in talking about this really important issue, and it's to help explain why we're in this emergency right now, is because there's been no solution to this structural funding dilemma to solve it. So it's accumulated, and it's now facing us for fiscal '22 in a large way. Moving on to some more specific information relative to the fiscal '22 budget. Again, starting with now some of the technical pieces that are built into and implicit in Dr. Sawyer's request to you tonight. The big categories, if you will, salaries and wages. We know that we have a labor contract with our two professional level staff organizations, the teachers union and assistant principals. Those salary schedules call for a 2% increase. The non-union salaries and wages have been budgeted for 2% wage increases, and we've made a projection for our paraprofessional union because we don't have a settled contract with them at this particular time. For our supply accounts, many of the accounts that are utilized by our principals and department leaders for educational supplies have been level funded. We've made only increases in those areas where we have no need to increase them. So many of the site-based funds that are available to those administrators will be level funded in next year's budget, meaning 0% increase. With respect to transportation, our rate for each bus is up by 2.9% per contract. And some of that is moderated in terms of the total cost of transportation, you'll see, by projecting that we'll be charging a bus fee again next year. We did not do that this year, of course, and we had planned at the beginning of the year that we would have no bus fee revenue. And so now when we build that back in, that kind of helps offset some of the increase from the appropriations budget. The special education tuitions budget, those rates for students attending special education placements are regulated by the state, and they've been afforded a 2.2% rate increase. And also, some organizations, some of the private schools can apply for higher rates if they're approved by the state. We've built those into our budget for those placements as well. Vocational students, right now, based upon the information that we have, we're budgeting for a net increase of 4 more students and an estimated annual tuition rate up 2.5% to $16,743 per student. A few more assumptions with respect to revenue and other funding sources. Right now, we are planning on level funding. This is our baseline assumption every year for federal and state grants, the major grant funding categories. You've got a lot of details in the budget book, a whole page that shows every grant that we receive on an annual basis. I won't go through all that right now. We are receiving some coronavirus grant funding, which I'm going to go over. We're not planning for continuation of that. That's really kind of one-time money. Full-day kindergarten tuition is another revenue that we've typically received. Because of the pandemic, it was waived this year. But it is assumed to be eliminated for fiscal '22 based upon your guidance as set forth at the beginning of the budget process. I'm going to show a little bit more information about that. And then special education circuit breaker revenue, based upon the governor's budget, I'm assuming a 73% reimbursement rate there. We know that the maximum is 75%, so we'll see how that plays out as the process unfolds. Next slide, another key piece of information, putting together budgets, of course, is what is our enrollment going to be? And so this is just kind of a summary chart of enrollment. Back in fiscal '20, we were a school district of, this is just in-district pupils, 6,268. And in the current year, 2020, 2021, we know that the pandemic has impacted our enrollment as it has with every other public school district in the nation. And our pre-K and kindergarten enrollments are down significantly. I know Dr. Sawyer presented about that last fall, all those details. So our enrollment is actually down this year, 275 students or 4.4%. For next year, I'm projecting that we're going to be 6,192 students, or up 3.3% from the current year, or just about 200 students. And you can see that most of them would be in the pre-K and kindergarten, K through 4 levels. Shifting gears a little bit, this is another kind of assumption, if you will, with respect to putting together the fiscal '22 appropriations budget that we bring to town meeting. What's going to happen with COVID? How are we going to deal with the impacts of COVID? And right now, we know that we've received significant funding to deal with that from both the state and federal government. And this is a recap of all those various buckets of funding that we have received and then their ending date for use. Again, these funds are time-limited, they're one-time money, and they're use-restricted. It's just not a check. It's not just a general revenue. It has to be used specifically to offset COVID-related costs. So to date, the school district has received $2.35 million directly. We've also accessed just over $758,000 of the municipal CARES funding for a total of $3.1 million. And this has really been much-needed funding to, on the next slide, you can see, fund all of our costs for personal protective equipment that we've purchased in the schools, from hand sanitizer to masks to desk dividers, gowns for nurses, hand sanitizer. We've also used this funding to hire part-time COVID assistant staff, which are helping with the cleaning of schools during the daytime and monitoring of social distancing of students. They're cleaning desks in between lunches. And now they're also helping us with our COVID surveillance testing program by conducting the process that Dr. Sawyer mentioned at the beginning of the meeting in terms of just processing in samples for our weekly COVID surveillance testing. And by the way, I know Mr. Pizzidlo just made a call this evening to remind high school parents that we plan to roll out surveillance testing at the high school level right after February break. And it's really, really important that folks who have high school students sign up and give us their consent by the end of the week so that we can get them in the system. And then when they come back on that Monday, we're going to give them a test kit and they'll be able to be good to go for testing. We've also used this funding to hire and pay for remote learning teachers, substitute teachers, and additional nursing support. Of course, we procured a large number of iPads, technology hardware, and new software programs to help educate our students. We're funding our COVID surveillance testing program out of this funding, and then all the furniture moving and storage that was required to set up appropriate distancing in our classrooms across the district. So that's just generally how we've been using those funds. There are no dollars in our appropriations request to you in the request that Dr. Sori just made to you and included in next year's budget recommendation. There are no dollars in there to cover COVID costs. Our plan is to use the existing remaining funding that we have, and we know that there is another round of funding coming from the federal government. I heard a little bit of more of a next level of detail from the State Department of Education today, and we know that there is money coming, and so our plan is to approach those COVID-related costs by using that future money. We don't know how much it's going to be, and we don't know when it's coming, but what we do know is that we'll probably learn the answers to those two questions sometime in the mid to late March timeframe, and that if that actually happens, then we'd begin to see money sometime in April. So that's what the latest update is that I have for you on that. And of course, using this kind of approach is, it's not simply wishful thinking. We know we have good data to tell us that there is money coming, but there is some risk that either it's not going to be enough to meet our needs, or that it might be so restricted in use that it doesn't help us the way that we want it to help us. So I just wanted to make mention of that as well. So shifting back to now a little bit more specifics, those are some of the assumptions that are underpinning this thing. This is just a high-level summary of the $75.4 million request. And you can see that the salaries and wages category up by just about $3.2 million, over 5%. Transportation services, again, very minimal impact just because of the budgeting tactics that we had for this year and planning for next year's issuance, if you will, of the bus fee that parents would be expected to pay for bus service. Out-of-district tuitions, up $2.4 million, 39%. I'm going to talk a little bit more about why that is later in these slides. And supplies, materials, and contract services, which includes software licensing, leasing of technology, things like that, up about $124,000 or 3.7%. And then just the whole new Beal school, I just put it in a separate category, just under $1.7 million. So that's kind of the high level, and this is more information about, why is this year's increase so much more than normal. And certainly it was predictable, as I said before. And also what we did for the current year, and we've used this terminology of basically survival tactics to get us into this school year in the best position that we could be in. But it's obviously kind of just generally deferred the survival tactics, the problem, into fiscal '22. So because of a lack of funding, the school committee voted to implement, as part of the budget, a salary freeze for all non-union staff for this year, to include administrators, the clerical staff, technology support staff, and other miscellaneous positions. The school committee also worked with two major labor unions, Unit A and Unit B, to reach compromise on salaries for this year. And these two labor groups deferred, the teachers, the counselors, assistant principals, deferred the cost of their living increases this year and step increases this year for half the year. So they took what was bargained as their increases and basically cut it in half. That's what was agreed to. The next slide is basically an accounting of what that resulted in, which was over $1 million in pay that Unit A gave up, and just over $24,000 from the smaller group. Excuse me. 10 staff of assistant principals and the athletic director, $24,000. And then the pay freeze for administration, the clerical group, and non-union folks, just under $108,000. So all of this compensation savings, nearly $1.2 million, was a savings from this year, and saved jobs for this year. Next slide. We also had a number of savings out of our fiscal '20 budget due to the COVID closures. When we shut down schools in March, of course, we had reduced transportation costs, we had reduced costs for substitute teachers, educational supplies and general supplies, and all of those things, just generally the way that we were operating, resulted in a over $1.6 million budget surplus that was effectively saved, and we're able to mechanically bring it through the circuit breaker account and leverage those dollars to help us for fiscal '21 and offset special education tuitions in this year and avoid additional cuts for this year. So what does that mean? It means basically that we have to reinstitute those dollars for fiscal '22. And that's combine those two figures of the $1.6 million in budget savings and then the compensation givebacks by the labor unions amounts to $2.8 million. And had those things not happened, this year would have been much more of a disaster than it was. And just as a reminder, as Dr. Sawyer mentioned, we did cut nearly 30 positions out of this year's budget, $1.95 million. So these survival tactics are certainly important to help us this year, but they're certainly not a best practice. This is not what you want to be doing. These are, in fact, why they're called that. They're basically just survival tactics. This is not the way that we ought to be budgeting, and it's due to the lack of revenue. Just an example about how this works, because I know there's been some questions from folks about these savings, and so I just wanted to walk through an example of what would be an example teacher, and that over $1 million that collectively the teachers union gave up. And what does it mean on an individual basis? So this would be an example of a teacher who has a master's degree and is on step 6 of our salary schedule. And by the way, our salary schedule is in the budget book, so if people want to look at that tomorrow, they can take a look at that. But if, for example, they were a step 6 individual in fiscal '20, they are eligible to move to step 7 in this current year and receive a salary of $68,702. That is what they would have been paid this year if they were on step 6 with a master's degree. But collectively, again, the labor agreement was renegotiated, and that salary was decreased down to $65,814. So, excuse me, in that case, that teacher sacrificed $2,888. Now, the collective bargaining agreement calls for that teacher to move to step 8 for fiscal '22, and that salary is set at $72,381. So you can see that in a normal year, if they had received their full compensation in the current year and then simply moved to fiscal '22, their raise would have been $3,679, but now, because they gave up half their salary in fiscal '21. We need to make up that entire difference, so the raise is $6,567 is what we need to be budgeting for in terms of an increase for fiscal '22. So it's real savings. It's real savings for us this year. It's saved jobs. It's less money for the teachers this year. But again, we need to meet our obligations for fiscal '22. It's just a higher threshold to meet, given the sacrifice that they made. In terms of the staffing plan, this is just a comparison of our current year and next year by kind of major category. You can see there that the patent principal was left vacant. That position was not eliminated for this current year. It was just simply left vacant. And so we have budgeted for filling that position for fiscal '22. During the course of the year, at the outset of the year, we realized based upon course selections of all of our students collectively that we needed to add 0.3 for foreign language in this year. Had not been budgeted for, so we need to carry forward that 0.3 for fiscal '22. We're projecting that there's going to be a need for a net increase of 4.2 special education paraprofessionals based upon individual educational plans. That would be an enrollment-related piece. And then finally, you know from the prior reports that we've provided that because of all the additional technology that's been rolled out, additional iPads for elementary students, additional support for remote educational learning, that what was added in this year and funded through COVID dollars was 3 additional instructional IT support staff. Again, we're not planning on continuation of funding next year for those, so we need to pick up those positions in our appropriations budget, and so that's why there's a net increase of 3 there. And then finally, we're planning for a decrease in unclassified staff, primarily door monitors of 1.4. So just kind of the status quo, bringing these things forward does require 7.1 additional FTE. In terms of the status quo budget, again, that's a $5.7 million increase, just about 8.5%. And this is what's needed to maintain current level of services. That was kind of the goal number 1 that Dr. Sawyer put forth. Maintain our current programs and current personnel. That's our status quo, $5.7 million. And then the next slide is to open up Beal, realign all of our elementary schools, and conduct redistricting. It's an additional about 1.7 million or 2.5%. And that figure, 1.7 million or 1.692, is again, just as a reminder, we were asked for estimates a couple of years ago about what it would cost to open up Beal, and we did a very detailed forecast at that time. Again, all the staffing for details of the staffing required to open up Beal are in the last page of your budget book by type of job and FTE, planning for transfers of existing staff from the existing Beal school to the new Beal school. But again, this is $307,000 less than what that projection was back then. And it does add 32.5 new full-time equivalent staff. So again, I'll turn it back to Dr. Sawyer, again with what was set out at the beginning, which is this $7.45 million increase, 10.95%. So those are some of the financial details and some of the reasons for the larger increase required for the upcoming year, fiscal '22.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Move to the next slide and just recap what the budget gap that we are facing. Based on my recommendation of $75.4 million versus the town manager's recommendation of just $70.5 million. That creates a gap of about $4.9 million. Again, just to reiterate that the town manager must submit a balanced budget based on estimated revenues whereas my recommendation is based on our program and to preserve the necessary resources that we currently have in place, as well as to add the additional staff to bring Beal on according to our plan. Next slide shows what some of the, at a high level, some of the damage that we will sustain if we are not able to somehow receive additional funding to meet this budget plan. First off, obviously, it would not make sense if we're going to need to make a very significant number of cuts to personnel and program to add new staff to open up a new school. So the first would be, of course, deeply disappointing and unsettling would be if we're not able to open the new Beal School as planned, and instead essentially take the existing staff of the current Beal School out of the old building that they're in now, move the operation to the new building. It will be severely underutilized, of course, under those circumstances, but it would not require the addition of those 32-plus staff in order to make the program work across all of the K-4 elementary schools as designed. So that is would be the first $1.7 million off the top. But that still leaves a gap of about $3.2 million. And those reductions would have to be some combination of personnel, of administrators, teachers, paraprofessionals, support staff. We have shaved back and been as as efficient as we possibly can be, not only over the last few years, but over the last couple of decades. And as you saw, the quotation from the 2013 fiscal study report, just as other town departments, we operate in as lean a mode as we possibly can. And there are certain investments we just need to make every year for technology, for materials, that we just need to in order to do business. And those are essentially level funded, and now we're not adding anything there unless we absolutely need to. So this will be because we're personnel heavy as an organization, as every school district is, it's going to result in staffing cuts if we can't get somehow additional revenue. And just to give some sense of proportion, if we use a teacher's salary of about $66,000, if you look at that, that would be approximately 48.5 full-time equivalent staff cut if we're using that teacher number. If there were different types of staffing combinations, it could be more or less numbers of positions, but you're talking about somewhere on the order of potentially 50 individual jobs being reduced from the budget. The year following, we just reduced 30. That would be a devastating situation for our school district under any scenario. To do that during an education emergency under COVID, to me, would be unconscionable. And I believe we really need the community to step up and find a way to provide the resources that we need to do the work that's expected of us and that our students need. This next slide indicates, what are some options for solving the problem. Because I continue to be an optimist and believe that there are ways to solve this problem. The first, and the question in many people's mind, and Mr. Collins spoke to a little bit earlier, what about federal stimulus? What about the rescue package that's being debated in D.C.? And it is possible that ultimately that rescue package has some dollars that we could utilize to help bridge the gap and deal with what school districts across the country are dealing with, where their communities and municipalities have some revenue challenges from last year and this year in some ways relative to COVID, and to deal with the situation. That would be terrific if we received money. That was very helpful. We received some federal dollars during the Great Recession that helped us save a lot of teachers' jobs before the economy recovered. However, that's out of our control, whether or not that's going to come through. The timing of it doesn't really match what our budget schedule is and our decision-making timeframe that we need to stick to. It's unlikely that there'll be unrestricted dollars because so far all the dollars that have been coming from the federal government around the COVID crisis have been restricted to only costs that are directly related to COVID somehow. And the bottom line is it's one-time money. It could help bridge a gap, and obviously we'd welcome that to take some pressure off of us locally, but it certainly does not solve the long-term funding dilemma that we've been facing for years. So the only other option that I see as viable, and if someone has a different one that would provide revenue and resources to us that we can't conceive of at this point, obviously we're all ears. But the other one is essentially revenue that comes via an operational override. That is within the control of local government leaders and community members ultimately if it goes to the ballot. A timeline could better match our budget cycle and help us with making the decisions we need to make, as whether to open the new Beal School and give people some certainty with regard to what's happening. And of course, it would provide recurring revenue that would help solve the longer-term problem that we've been in. So that's really, at this point, the only two options that I see. In terms of the timing of the decision-making, it's really critical that we do this sooner rather than later and hopefully understand and know whether or not any of these options are possible, because we have lead time that we need to execute the plans to open the Beal School. This is not, we cannot wait. You know, the 2014 override, which was much welcome and it was desperately needed, it made an unbelievable difference. We would be a different school district today if that override had not passed. It really saved our bacon at the time and has allowed us to continue what we've been able to provide over a number of years. We're 7 years in now. But in terms of, that was an early June election. And we made it work. We hired a massive amount of staff over that summer. It was not optimal. But to think about trying to open a new school and hopefully open all of our schools up again during a pandemic, we cannot wait until June to find out whether or not we're going to have funding. We know we're going to have to do some dual planning about what if we have the money or don't. Obviously, it's going to be up to the Board of Selectmen to decide whether or not an override question will be placed on the ballot. And then ultimately, whatever the timing of that election is, then we will know for certain. And in advance of that, we'll have to make some alternative plans. But we cannot wait. Just the hiring we would have to do, it will be too late to do that kind of hiring under the circumstances we have today. And then just all our schools, and particularly the high school with course selection and building a very complicated schedule. There are a variety of reasons why we need some information sooner rather than later to help us understand what's going to be at play. So finally, the timeline that we have here is that is different than we typically would have happen under a normal budget cycle. Because time is so much of the essence, we will be bringing to the school committee 2 weeks from this evening a reduction plan. That is much faster than we typically would do, but it's clear that the community needs to understand what is at stake, needs to understand what the plan would be to the greatest extent we can at this point in the process, what kinds of positions, what that would do for class sizes, which is pretty simple. They're going to go up substantially. What it may do for programming and what kind of programming might be cut. Just as this year we cut foreign language out of Sherwood entirely. We've cut health in recent years. It has not been restored. There's a variety of things that we've done. What else would have? What other kind of damage would we sustain? We will be presenting that 2 weeks from tonight. And then over the course of March and April, we'll continue to discuss what's happening. There'll be a public hearing sometime in March, a school committee meeting. We're scheduled to meet with the Finance Committee on March 27th, and the annual town meeting currently is scheduled for May 17th, and that is when the town budget is appropriated to the schools. But it is certainly my hope that we can find a way, together as a community, to solve this really difficult problem. I do not use the words education emergency lightly. That is what we face. It is incumbent upon me as the Chief Educational Officer of the community to let the community know that we face a devastating situation next year if we do not receive more revenue than what's currently available to the town. The federal government may help out to an extent, that remains to be seen, but I would urge the community to be able to take action of what we do have control over and to respond because our kids need that, our educators need it to serve our students, and the quality of the education that has been a hallmark of this community for a long, long time is seriously at risk. I wish I had a different message for you, but that is the reality we face. I appreciate your patience, but we felt it was important to provide you with all this information this evening. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions and hear the committee's perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. Mr. Collins, questions and comments from the committee? Start with Ms. Heffernan.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Dr. Sawyer, and certainly Mr. Collins for all of the work. My first emotion that I have is this is sad, that we have spent so much energy going through this fiscal drama at literally every turn, particularly given the relative affluence of our town. I want to say I watched the Board of Selectmen meeting last night, and I appreciate the creativity in trying to figure out how to support the schools. Dr. Mizikar presented a very tight budget, using the vast majority of the unrestricted surpluses that he had at his disposal to provide them to the schools, and in doing so, denied many of our other town departments what seemed like very reasonable requests that they had. And what that tells me is that all across the town, our budgets are lean. I know that our town employees and the Board of Selectmen love this community as much as we do. I have no doubt about that. But frankly, you can't squeeze blood from a stone. And what has become more clear to me, the longer I have lived here and the more I've engaged in town government, first as a committed just community member, as a parent, as a town meeting member, and now as a school committee member, is that an operational override to increase local tax rates must happen and must happen now. It moves me to the point of anger because this is so predictable, and yet we do nothing. The use of the word emergency by you, Dr. Sawyer, is jarring and should be jarring to everybody in this community. We cannot stand for the pain of these cuts. Not this year with the educational losses and the social emotional impact on our kids, not with the dedicated work that our teachers have put in this year, not when all of my conversations with community members say that there is support for this action in this community. Frankly, being in the bottom 11% of spending in this state is shameful, especially given the love that I know people have. I try to imagine what our schools would look like if we got to average, an extra $18 million. Average. It would be incredible, right? And yet, we know that we are a community that thinks we are better than average, and we can't even get there. So when we think about, is this necessary? I say yes. Will it be hard? I say yes. And when do we need it? We need it now. So I call on the town leadership and our friends at the Board of Selectmen to do what is needed to let our community decide at the ballot box this spring if they want to see these cuts happen. That's our only way out of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Go down the line, Jason.
Lest the weight of this moment fail to hit anyone in the face like it's hit all of us recently, we're having a conversation about potentially not opening a school that 67% of our neighbors felt was necessary to fund the construction of. That is something that leads me to sit here and be probably more angry than I have ever been in my going on 7 years on this committee. I am as ever angered, as Ms. Heffernan eloquently noted, by the fact that this is something we've been talking about for a long time, and this is something we do on a year-to-year basis. Shrewsbury's property tax revenues are not sufficient to meet the service expectations of residents. That cake was baked a long time ago. That is something that has been true for a long time, and the town has dealt with that in fits and starts. And at times, specific solutions, or in the case of the 2014 operational override, a broader solution have presented themselves where we've been able to make some progress, but inevitably the structural nature of this gap catches up with us and reasserts itself. We are right now in a situation that I think is beyond comparable to 2013, 2014. Because in addition to potentially massive layoffs, getting class sizes back to where they were back in those dark times, we are looking at a beautiful new facility that 67% of our neighbors decided was necessary for capacity reasons, being not vacant, but enormously underutilized and absolutely not meeting the needs that it was or is being constructed to fill. As I mentioned, this is not a new situation. Ms. Heffernan mentioned this is not a new situation. Mr. Collins, Dr. Sawyer have mentioned this is not a new situation. This is something that's long in coming. And it is not a situation that we're going to be able to simply manage our way out of or sharpen our pencils through. This is a very well-managed community, and I want to echo again Ms. Heffernan's words in praising our municipal leadership, the town manager and his team, and everybody who works here at Town Hall. Shrewsbury is an extraordinarily well-managed community, but this is not a situation that we're going to be able to manage our way out of. This is a situation that calls for a certain type of leadership. a type of leadership necessary to do something that is alarming, unpopular perhaps, but absolutely necessary. And let me, as an aside, say I think it will prove to be more popular than some might expect. But we're not going to sharpen our pencils out of this situation. I'm looking at the superintendent's slide number 46, where he, from a very high level, outlines potential reductions. So $1.6 million from not opening Beal the way that residents expect is going to potentially leave us over $3 million in the hole. If failing to open a school is going to leave us $3 million in the hole, there's no little tweak around the edges that is going to solve this problem. This is a severe structural problem, a long time growing, that has come home to roost, and we need to address it, and we need to address it immediately. If it were up to the five of us to make the decision as to what the town would set its revenues at, we would. It isn't. This is a difficult choice that's going to need to be made by others, and I feel very strongly that the residents of this community need to have a voice in making that decision. This is a solution, this is a situation that is either going to be solved through new revenues or not solved and manifest itself in severe degradation of services. We're either going to get the money to make substantial progress towards closing this gap, or we're going to take a sledgehammer to programming that is already operating on the needle of a pin. The bottom 11% of per pupil spending for the 70th wealthiest of 351 cities and towns in what is, depending on the year, usually the third or fourth wealthiest state in the richest nation in the world. We do what we do on the needle of a pin, and we're about to fall off. I worked very hard, as did others in this community, including others in this room, to talk to the community about the need for the new Beal School. The community responded positively. It was an overwhelming vote to make through a separate financial stream that investment, and we are now on the precipice of having to have a large, expensive structure be severely underutilized as a monument to this town's inability to address a long-standing situation that is staggeringly awful.
Thank you. Dale?
I'm going to try to be very brief here. I think a potent argument has been made for us raising more funds for the schools. They're efficiently run. The money is not coming any other way than us having an override. And unless it happens very soon, the schools will suffer, and if the money comes light, damage can be done before the new money arrives. So I think that it's clear we need an override, and we need it very quickly. I think that the next stop is with the selectmen. They have to put this forward, and they need to support us in this quest to make sure that we all, as people who are in positions of making decisions for this community, do so with the intent of maintaining, at a minimum, maintaining the services we deliver. The idea of having services in this community be degraded from one year to another, of the quality of education from one year to another going down, of one sibling getting a different education than their sibling received a year earlier, is beneath what the people who live in this town expect. They expect more, they deserve more, and the selectmen need to put a override forward this spring. And if there's an action point for anyone listening to this, that action point is to contact the selectmen with that message.
Thank you.
Clearly deeply disappointed that we're at this point for the town. We've been headed for this cliff for a while now. I mean, this predates COVID, and anyone elected to pay attention, including this board, knows that this is no surprise, right? 15 years of town and school fiscal reporting that's told us that we have a problem, a structural funding problem as a town. As Mr. Collins said, this is well documented and totally predictable. In addition to the reporting reductions in staff over the last several years, 30 staff cuts and shared sacrifice of the district staff just to get to zero, just to get to a balanced budget this year. A tactic just to get all of this, we still don't have a plan. There's no short-term plan, there's no long-term plan, and now it's exacerbated by COVID. right? So you can only blame COVID so much for it. Well, we know that this has been there. So what is the plan, right? We need a plan. The context is in this book. You have all the data you need to make an informed decision. So we need to know what that plan is. And the ask is simple. We're asking to keep our current staffing levels and open the new Beal School as planned and as promised. There's no additional programs or replacement staff that's been lost over the last 3 years, including those 30 staff cuts that happened in this current school year. The context is clear. With that said, I think, it's important to keep the faith and take things one day at a time here. We're all in this together. I think it's, important for those that are watching tonight. This is the first time that you've been presented with this level of context, kind of answer some of the concerns we had in the last meeting. And I understand that. And I think one of the key reasons that I know I'm sitting here is how the town rallied in 2014. I was inspired by that. It got me to want to get more involved in the community. And here I am, So as a town, even at this late stage in the budget process, we can still come together and solve the problem. But your voice needs to be heard. And this budget season is unlike any other we've seen before. As we previously stated, in addition to the financial challenges, our students' social and emotional well-being is also of concern. With the hybrid model being in class in the building twice a week, we desperately want to get our students back into the classroom. I also want to, say that I appreciate the dedication and commitment of the school leadership, the staff, the educators. This has unquestionably been the most difficult year in their careers, and I really appreciate, the work that they put in to keep our students safe. And I'm also concerned about, in hearing all of what we've provided to the public today, concerned about office morale, and how this is seen from a teacher's lens, and just know that, we're here to support you and advocate for you, but we need the community support on this issue. So make your voice heard, email your selectmen, let them know you want an operational override on the ballot. You should be able to make that decision. And, it's up to us to help you understand the problem. You have the context, and appreciate everybody's listening tonight.
Thank you, John. I want to talk about the two fiscal study committee reports. One was in '07, and there's a couple of statements in both of those that resonate in 2021. In '07, and these are directly from the reports, if we wish to maintain current service levels, the town will have to find ways to increase its revenue stream. The committee is satisfied that there are no major opportunities for the town to increase revenue from current sources. Question posed for consideration by the community was the issues of priorities. What is important to the residents of this town? What services do we believe this town should offer and at what level? In 2013, this fiscal study report asked or stated, we have reached a critical period whereby it is not obvious how we can continue to provide the services that the town residents come to expect within the current budget parameters. Key questions going forward is, what kind of community do we wish to be and what are our priorities? So as we sit here today, we still have the same questions, the same concerns. We still have the same ongoing structural funding dilemma. Nothing is new with this question. The school department, the school committee, as well as the other town boards still have the same issue. Again, nothing is new. And I looked back through my notes from last year. We started the budget discussion on January 5th of 2020. And we were talking about issues with the budget. We were looking at it almost in a 2-year cycle, FY21, FY22, because we knew we were going to be opening the Beal School, and we knew it would be a difficult year going forward. We knew COVID was coming. We did not know COVID would come to be as it passes today. But again, COVID is not the reason that we have the huge budget issue that we have. It's the structural dilemma that we have going forward. I do have to say we've had a lot of discussions with the Board of Selectmen, Kevin Mizikar, since January. We've had bi-monthly meetings. It's been very, very helpful that we've had these ongoing discussions because we've all been kept up to date. So again, helpful, but the planning has to move forward. And I do want to talk about how we as a school department has responded to the structural funding dilemma as a school department. What have we done over the years? Well, we've carefully managed budget funds, and I think Mr. Collins' budget history is a really clear presentation. You can see that we've had excellent student results, and that is shown year after year by standard test results. And if you look at per pupil spending, again, way below the state average. Our town receives excellent return on investment. The taxpayers are getting that year after year. We also, as a school department, supplement revenue. I don't know a lot of districts who do what we do. The Colonial Fund, the amount of money that was raised to put in the turf field up at the high school. There's grants, there's community sponsorships, the PTO organizations. A significant amount of money is brought into the school department because that funding for all those things cannot come out of the regular budget. So lots and lots of revenue is brought in. We also reduce and eliminate. So we cut in order to have a balanced budget. So even with a status quo budget, you're still having inflationary costs and mandated costs. So you're having kind of a negative cycle. So we're asking for X, we get Y. So every year, we're getting a little less and a little less, and we're chipping away and chipping away. So again, we're a well-managed town, very well-managed town, municipal and schools. But again, there's not enough revenue to meet the simple demands of the schools and the municipal side. So what we talked about in '07, in '13, is true today, 14 years later than those studies. So we have two issues with our current budget. And we have a budget gap that needs to be resolved. We need to open a school, and we have educational services for all students. And we have to solve it some way. I think at this point, and John mentioned it, we also have short and long-term planning that needs to be done one way or the other. I think we're at that pinnacle where something has to start happening so that we're not continually in the cycle of trying to catch up, funding, trying to catch up and not getting what we need. So I know Dr. Sawyer is going to present a very detailed reduction plan on the 24th. Based on the magnitude of that gap, it could mean we don't open the Vail School that was promised to the community, or we have a severe reduction in staff, which is going to be devastating to our students and our staff. So we have a lot ahead of us. So on the 25th, I will be reaching out to the Board of Selectmen and asking them to immediately set up a meeting with us so that we can sit down and really start to develop a mitigation plan, including a request to put an operational override before the community. It's something that if there's no other way, we have to ask that that be done and let the voters decide. So I think that is what I would expect going forward. Anything further? No? Dr. Sawyer, Mr. Collins, anything else?
Oh, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, next on the agenda, we will be moving forward with our redistricting elementary school attendance vote.
Madam Chair, just a point of order for a moment. Given what we've just heard, I don't know how we move forward with the redistricting vote. The incredible amount of uncertainty that we have to open Beal, as Mr. Collins just said, we need 1.7 million, and yet on the other hand, we're saying, Dr. Sawyer, come to us in 2 weeks with a $4.9 million reduction. I think we run the risk of messaging to staff and families that those doors are going to open, and I'm not feeling that confidence. I don't know how we do that. I'm very interested to hear how, from my other colleagues. I recognize I'm out of order here, but this decision impacts students, families, all of our staff at the elementary level to be reshuffled around and to think about the hiring decisions that must be made. And I know there was lots of work by the redistricting committee, and it is an incredibly complicated and important decision, but I am at a loss as to why we would move forward with this, given the confusion that it would cause, especially when we are millions of dollars away from closing this gap. We're not close and near the edge. it frankly feels irresponsible. On the one hand, it feels sort of like a foolish exercise. On the other hand, it's projecting some level of certainty that I don't have right now. I'm sitting here feeling like we're closing doors, we're not opening doors. So I would just, I'm not sure this is the time for us to be making this movement.
Jason?
I find myself agreeing with Ms. Heffernan's remarks, and if a motion to table is being offered, I would support it and/or second it. This is, I feel, the wrong message for us to send to the community if we were to proceed with redistricting, as if everything were otherwise on track. Obviously, redistricting is a choice we're going to have to make at some point, and that can't be moved too far down the road. But I think of everyone who engaged extraordinarily thoughtfully with the redistricting process, and that's everyone from the parents who participated in the redistricting committee, and dozens of people who engaged with us directly via email, or there was also a ton of social media dialogue as well. We had community members who were engaging with the redistricting conversation as a vehicle to discuss important policy changes, especially around how we best serve students in the sense of equity and inclusion. We had families engaging with us because they wanted to know where their kid was going to go to school, and that's on an emotional level and a practical level, something very important to them. And a lot of people engaged for both of those reasons. And I feel to move forward as if everything was fine is going to send the wrong message to the folks who engage with this process that that's going to happen as we expected, because we don't know that it's going to happen as expected. I do not think it's a good faith move on our part if we were to move forward and finalize that process tonight and leave anyone with the sense that the opening of Beal was a done deal.
Any other comment?
I agree. I would say that with no opening of Beal, there's no point to redistricting. And so we're putting the cart before the horse here.
Okay, so you've made a motion that we table?
I suppose I have informally made a motion, so why don't I formally make a motion that we table this until we have some greater certainty? It bears to mind, the state put funds towards Beal, right? This is not just a town-wide decision, although the voters overwhelmingly approved it. What are the consequences to us, to the rest of this community? How will that trickle down to our budget? I think there's a lot that we don't know. We promised that we were going to put 750 children into that building, or give or take. If we're not making that move as a community, I can't imagine the state's going to say, enjoy your many millions of dollars. I think there's too much unknown. So, yes, I'm sorry. I would make a motion that we table this decision.
I second that motion.
Okay, so I'm going to make a motion that we table the discussion of redistricting the elementary school attendance zone to our meeting on February 24th, 2021.
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye, motion carries.
And just, that was a substitute motion for the.
Motion,
Okay.
substitute motion, so we have a date. Just before we go any further on that, is that for timing-wise, for the redistricting plan, 2 weeks, would that make any difference to you, Dr. Sawyer and Mr. Collins?
No, I mean, I certainly appreciate the sentiment of the committee and totally understand the decision not to take this up this evening under the circumstances. As I think I mentioned a bit during my presentation, we are going to be going through a period of time where we're going to have to be considering sort of multiple planning modes of whether we are going to have some revenue or not. While we won't know certainly 2 weeks from tonight whether that will be the case, my initial thinking is that it would still behoove us to be thinking about making a decision about the plan so that we can begin the process of communications. Obviously, we'd have to be very careful and thoughtful about those communications in terms of, what would be, and not sending the message unintentionally that, well, this is just going to happen no matter what. We'll have to be very clear about that. I think a 2-week delay would not put us in a compromised position. Beyond 2 weeks could be problematic for us if we get deeper into beyond February. So my initial thinking right now, this evening, would be that we would want the committee to make a decision on the plan for when it is implemented, when the new school opens, at your next meeting 2 weeks from tonight. But that's, I'll obviously give some thought and communicate with Mr. Collins and in advance of the materials for the next meeting, provide some thinking about that.
Okay, perfect. Is that? Great, thank you. Okay, next we will have a report, our staffing report for 2020, 2021, and Ms. Malone will provide that.
So I just wanted to start by explaining how we track our staffing. So we have a system that's called Munis. It's the municipal information system in use by the town, by the school department for accounting and payroll. And when we use Munis, we can run reports very easily, download them into Excel, and we can manipulate them in a variety of ways. So it's very useful. And you may recall a couple of years ago, we began to implement a position control project that assisted us in being able to manipulate those reports. We also deliver a staffing report to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And that is delivered in December of every year with the date of October 1st as the date that matters. And they publicize it in the following year. That is based off of the Power School system, which is a different system from Munis. Power School interfaces through a intermediary platform with the department, whereas Munis doesn't, or doesn't completely. So Power School is what we have to use for staff and student records and scheduling. So it's necessary for us to maintain these two separate systems. And what our human resources and IT staff do is they cross-reference what we have in Munis for payroll purposes with what we have in Power School for staff for scheduling purposes. And I would really be neglectful if I didn't mention that Christine Matero, Pam Panarelli, and Eric Bauer on Brian LaRue's team are really the people who do the vast majority of that work behind the scenes to keep track of that. So our internal staffing report is based off of Munis. The state report is based off of Power School. The two systems are created and maintained for different purposes. So in our staffing overview, the FY21 budgeted, as I think you heard in the last report, and I went to look quickly and make sure our numbers agreed, and they do, was budget 842.80 positions. The FY21 actual on October 1st was 834.48 positions. So we were running at that point, I think the budget was actually approved in August. By October 1st, we were running 8 positions under that budgeted amount. The COVID-19 staffing impacts as of October 1st were at 25.8 FTE in long-term substitute teachers. And they were hired to staff both the hybrid and remote models, essentially standing up 2 separate schools, really, for those who were all remote and those who were participating in the hybrid model. The other factor we had in the fall was a highly competitive market for all roles, and that has continued throughout the year. So I want to be clear that that 25.8 FTE are not included in the actual positions here. That was, separate. The EPIM submission, which I think I stated in the report, is it's an information management system for education personnel. So it's education personnel information management systems. That was sent in December, and something that they do give back to us is demographic information, which we've never reported on before, although it's something that I've been looking at for at least 3 years. And as of our October 1st submission, 93.53% of our employees self-identify as white, which does not match our student demographic. And clearly, that's a benchmark for future progress in diversifying staff. I did note that within that pool of long-term substitutes that we hired, which was not part of this number, we did have more diversity in that group this year than I've ever seen in a group of long-term substitutes. Probably 1 in 4, 25%, were self-identifying as persons of color, but it's not part of what we report through EPIMS. If you go to our day-to-day substitute teachers, about 3 years ago, I was talking with Dr. Sawyer. I had noticed the lack of diversity in our staffing, and it made me think of something I had done earlier in my career and fleshed out with other people on the team, which was find a role that can be sort of your first start role and try to pull diversity into that role so that you can start building people into more permanent roles like paraprofessional or teacher. And so for us, the day-to-day substitute teacher is that role. That role became incredibly crucial this year and continues to be incredibly crucial in covering for teacher and paraprofessional quarantine needs. As of October 1st, we had 146 day-to-day subs on our roster. 48% self-reported as white. 32% did not self-report. 18% self-reported as Asian, and 2% self-reported as a member of a different group. This result is at least closer to our student demographic than what we saw in our group. So I think it's going to be important for us moving forward to, so 2 things. One is to make direct hires into paraprofessional and teacher and long-term substitute teacher roles, and look for a more diversified applicant pool. Because one of the things I've also noticed is that if you look at our applicants through School Spring, they're primarily white. So we have to find ways to get at other markets so that we can get more applicants into our pool so that we can have greater diversity every time we have a position open. Again, just harking back to the previous conversation, if we're looking at a whole bunch of cuts, our chances for diversifying the staff go down. But in a world where we're hiring for positions, that is a direct way that we can increase the diversity of our staff. And the second way is to really put effort into taking this day-to-day substitute teacher group and helping them get teacher licensure, walking them through the steps, and basically supporting that group. They already are used more in paraprofessional roles than I think we've ever had in the past, but it's getting them into the teacher role where licensure is required. I think that's the next step, where we have to be providing a service locally to our own internal pool. So those were the main points I wanted to make between the 2 different systems that we use and slight variations in numbers you may see between the 2 different systems. I wanted to share where we were at in terms of staffing, and I want to talk a little bit about the demographics. So I'm open to any questions if you have
Questions,
any.
Jason?
Just a comment, I appreciate your continued focus as obviously the person who leads our hiring on staff diversity and increasing staff diversity. I also want to commend the creativity in identifying what I'm sure some other districts see as simply an emergency need to fill as an opportunity to reach out to potential applicants who we might not otherwise have in sort of our more traditional applicant for the regular teaching positions, and use that as an opportunity to bring potential candidates in who can in turn be prepared for future roles with the district. I think that's a creative approach, and I'm glad to see it's taken.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think that brings up something really important, that the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education also created some means this year within the COVID emergency ways to bring in teachers who weren't licensed, so it became more possible to look at unlicensed candidates who had some experience to be a strong teacher without actually having passed, say, an MTEL test. So that was one thing that helped support that. I think, and I agree, and I appreciate you noting it, that when there's an emergency or crisis situation, you also have opportunities to build towards a future that is positive. And there's ample research to show that matching the demographics of the staff to the students is very powerful for the growth of students of all races and ethnicities. So thank you.
I'm similarly really happy that we're paying attention to this. We know it's important, obviously, our budget conversation notwithstanding, that we continue to look at how do we diversify our staff. And I would just encourage us to pay attention to, and I'm sure you are, but sort of as a community, that we pay attention to that, what I would say is a pretty high degree of people who are choosing not to report. Looking in my professional hat, looking data similar to this, over 30% of people not identifying when we think about what point in the process that is. Obviously, they're in a, this particular piece of the employee population is in a less stable role, right, as a daily substitute, so that could play into it, but that what it might tell us, we've spent a lot of time this school year thinking about morale and culture and what we're building and what we're trying to build toward, and it's one of those indicators I hope we keep our eye on, and that ideally I'd love to see that people feel like reporting their self-identifying is seen as a net positive, and that's hopefully a number we can drill down on, and I hope that many of those people would fall into some of the categories that we'd love to see reflect more of our student body. So thank you for making this data available. It's really important for us.
You're welcome, and that's a great point. We'll start looking at ways we can identify more what the unknowns are.
It's obviously completely in the right not to identify, right? So I'm not suggesting we do anything untoward, but that those things can be tied.
Absolutely, no pressure, but just even reminding people that that field is there on the paperwork if they choose to fill it out. Just that simple reminder may increase
Thank you.
the number of people who do.
And I thank you, because I was sitting here when you were talking, thinking back in the day, and we would literally go out in my corporate world and visit college campuses to recruit for new hires. We don't do that anymore because it's all online, and it's a different world for hiring. So you mentioned, with School Spring, it's difficult to look for diversity. And now, like Jason said, it's a different world, and we're having another way to do it. But I wonder when COVID's done and we go back, I think it will bring more difficulty again to find a diversified work group if people aren't self-identifying. And so thank you for helping during the crisis. It's actually adding to what we're looking for to make it a better diversified group. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and I agree. I think that there are such things as diversity fairs, and there are opportunities. So not only would I want the school committee to know, but I would want the public to know that, we're very interested as soon as it becomes a little safer to get out there, and some of them are virtual fairs. And we'll have to look at the ones that have the best track records for producing, candidates. But I think it's really two things. One is you grow from within, from your own community and your own families and your own parents and people who reflect the diversity of your own community. And the other is exactly as you say, going to where the diverse candidates are. It's probably a combination of both.
the two.
So I appreciate your comments too.
Thank you. Dr. Sawyer, any comments or questions?
I want to thank Ms. Malone, and certainly she mentioned it, but the team of Chris Matero and Pam Panarelli, Eric Bauer, and the work that they've done. It's a very, very complicated state report that takes a lot of effort, and it's one of the kind of reports that you send into the state. It spits back sometimes literally hundreds of errors, and oftentimes it's based on the way they're receiving the reports. They have to make adjustments. So I appreciate the time and effort they put into that. I appreciate Ms. Malone's focus on how we can expand our hiring range relative to looking at more diversity and of course, it's a conundrum that many school districts face where lack of licensed applicants perhaps, and then in terms of being a community that's a suburban community, not necessarily attracting as many, but we need to find ways to be proactive about that. I know that's something that the Coalition on Equity and Anti-Racism will be looking at in terms of one aspect of its work. So I appreciate the focus on that in this environment because it's important to do. And as far as the numbers, you can see that, again, we are in a position where it is a very tight labor market, and it's all the more reason why, planning going forward next year is very much a time-sensitive issue. But thank you to Ms. Malone, and appreciate the feedback from the committee.
Thank you. Okay, next, we are going to talk again about the updated policy on Title IX and anti-harassment. At our meeting on January 20th, we had the first reading of the draft. And based on feedback from the committee, the draft was submitted for further review by legal counsel in advance of tonight's vote. I'll turn it back to Ms. Malone for any updates.
Sure. So in your packet, you'll see that the school committee's council did move forward and make some additional changes to address the concerns of the committee. Some language was changed to make it more user-friendly. In addition, the concern, I believe it was Dr. McGee might have brought it up about consent and the legal definition of consent. So she provided some additional language to address that concern. The one thing she did not address that I believe was brought up in that meeting was the issue of how long you retain records. And she did indicate that she wanted to stick with the 7 years, that she thought it would be very difficult for the district to commit to retaining the records for 35 years. It's really not our obligation under the law to hold them for that long. But she also felt that if we had something that was likely to be needed within the 35-year period, it probably would have been reported to the police, and the police would have retained more detailed records on that. And she thought that was probably the more appropriate place for those records to be kept. So that was her advice. It's certainly a great point to bring up.
Any questions or comments?
Okay, just one question.
Sure.
I recognize that in it, we are required to provide training to our staff. Given the relatively limited amounts of professional development left, when do you find time to fit that in?
So
Or is this an ongoing, already built into the system, and we don't
Yeah.
have to worry?
So there's two things. So the next step will be to train everybody who's in a leadership role who would potentially be part of one of these processes, which would essentially be the central office leadership team, the school principals, and the school assistant principals. So that would be the first training that we would conduct. And then those training materials do need to be posted online per the new guideline for Title IX. The second, in terms of training our staff, we do an annual training that covers this issue and these kinds of policies. This past year, we just indicated, we provided the previous guidance and indicated that it would be under review of the school committee this year. We'll reissue it in a slide format for the remainder of this year. And that's how we'll address it for now, and then we'll look to our council to see if there's anything additional we need to do besides our typical annual training moving forward.
Thank you.
Anything else? No? Dr. Sir, any questions or comments?
No, I appreciate the feedback from the committee. I appreciate that Ms. Malone worked with our legal counsel to make some modifications, and I do recommend the updated version.
All right, may I have a motion that the committee vote to approve the updated policy titled Anti-Harassment in Title IX Policy as presented to be included in the school committee policies as both number 316 and number 645 in the Personnel and Student Services section respectively as presented.
Second.
Roll call vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next on the agenda, we have our minutes from our school committee meeting held on January 27th, 2021, and the school committee workshop held on February 3rd, 2021. Are there any changes or corrections? There being none, these can be marked as accepted as distributed. Okay, we do need to go into executive session this evening for the purpose of addressing Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A7, to comply with or act under the authority of any general or special law or federal grant and aid requirements. Purpose 7, Open Meeting Law, Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 22FG, for the purpose of reviewing, approving, and/or releasing executive session minutes. And B, for the purpose of addressing Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A3, to discuss strategy with respect to collective bargaining or litigation if an open meeting may have a detrimental effect of the bargaining or litigating position of the public body, and the chair so declares. Purpose 3, the Shrewsbury Education Association Units A and/or B, the Shrewsbury Paraprofessional Association and/or the Cafeteria Workers Association, where the deliberation in an open meeting may have a detrimental effect on the bargaining position of the public body, and we will return to open session only for the purpose of adjourning for the evening. May
So
I have
moved.
a motion that we adjourn to executive session?
Second.
Roll call vote is required. Ms. Heffernan?
Aye.
Mr. Palich?
Aye.
Dr.
Aye.
McGee? Mr. Wensky? Myself, aye. Thank you and good night.